we won't do anything. We won't publish the video that's being recorded. So, nevertheless, if you do have any kind of issues about us recording it, do let us know. So, yes. The title of the event, PhD Animation Research, Stop Motion Aesthetics. And as I said, we've got 3 participants who are each going to give a 10 to 15 minute short presentation on their research in this area. The order of the presentations is going to be, first of all, Toby Jungius, who is doing his PhD at where's my notes gone? At the University of Surrey. His PhD research is into the uncanny qualities of stop motion animation. And he's going to be speaking particularly about Ray Harryhausen's films in his presentation. And then we'll have Laura-Beth Cowley, who is doing her practice-led PhD at the University of West of England, looking at 3D printing in the context of stop motion animation. And then last but not least, Farzaneh Yazdandoost, who is doing her PhD at Anglia Ruskin University on puppet stop motion animation and materiality, and her presentation is specifically on the stop motion films of Wes Anderson. So as I said, the 10 to 15 minute presentations from these guys. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we're going to reserve the questions till the end after each of the participants have done their presentations. But you could type them into the chat at any moment if you like, if you need to do that as a kind of aid memoir, and we can come back to those questions at the end after the presentations. If I can't keep up with the questions in the chat and I miss them out, you could always signal them at the end, and we're very happy for people to join in and speak their questions out loud, or I can indeed read them for you. I think that's it, really, in terms of, is there anything else, Farzaneh, that I needed to say?
No, I think everything is fine. And we can start it.
Okay, all right, great. Without further ado then, Toby Jungius is first up.
Okay. I'm just trying to share screen, but apparently host has disabled screen sharing.
Well done. That's I knew there was something else I needed to do. Here it comes. Is that working now, Toby?
Yep, that should be. And all right. So before I begin, can everyone see the slides?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Without further ado, hello everyone, thank you for coming. This presentation is part of a broader project on a trend within commercial US stop motion, and what I'm talking about today is part of a chapter in progress on Ray Harryhausen and his films. In this presentation, I'll be providing context on Harryhausen and his reputation, before exploring how Harryhausen draws parallels between his creatures and the iconic story of King Kong to elicit a sense of lamentable tragedy to their fates, before providing an example of how stop motion enhances the tragic quality of his creatures' deaths. The man you see on the slide before you is Ray Harryhausen, a widely renowned name in the field of special effects. He was the animator who provided the special effects for Jason and the Argonauts, Clash of the Titans, and 13 other fantasy and sci-fi films that ranged from the 1950s to the early 1980s. The action sequences of these features showcased live-action actors interacting with beasts, statuesque golems, and an assortment of supernatural creatures which Harryhausen would render through the medium of stop motion. Harryhausen used a split-screen rear projection process to intersplice his stop-motion animation with live-action footage. Harryhausen's reputation and influence extends not only to special effects artists and stop-motion animators, but to the film-going public and even directors like Peter Jackson, James Cameron, and Guillermo del Toro. Part of this can be attributed to the marketing of these films, which can be observed in the stills taken from the original trailer for the 1958 film, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. The trailer showcases sequences which feature Harryhausen's effects, repeatedly proclaiming, "This is dynamation," a term devised to distinguish Harryhausen's stop motion from more traditional forms of animation. Features like this trailer indicate that this process of dynamation wasn't just implemented as a piece of technical trickery to be kept secret behind the curtain, but was proudly displayed as a means of drawing viewers in to watch these films. The dynamation for these key action sequences is embedded in the perceived identity of these films. But if that is the case, then what can be said about the identity of the stop motion characters who are front and center in these memorable sequences? Harryhausen's assortment of dynamation creatures. Having established how Harryhausen and his effects became so widely known, I propose that the status of these animated creatures as the main visual attraction for these films makes them not simply dangerous and repulsive monsters that we want to see the heroes vanquish along their journeys, but rather presents them as fantastical creatures who audiences are encouraged to revel in the act of witnessing them. Far from being repulsive, they are instead attractive to viewers. Therefore, I'm going to suggest in my talk today that as dangerous as these creatures may be in the context of the narrative, there is nevertheless an element at play in these films which allows for the possibility for audiences to become enamored with these monsters and even lament their passing when they are eventually defeated. An element of this tragic component can be traced back to one of the most important influences on Harryhausen's career as a stop-motion animator, Willis O'Brien, the special effects artist for such films as 1925's The Lost World and, most famously, the original 1933 King Kong, which Harryhausen has repeatedly cited as the film that sparked his interest in stop motion, eventually leading to him working under Willis O'Brien as an assistant animator on Mighty Joe Young in 1949. Harryhausen would evoke particularly iconic moments from King Kong, the film that had such an effect on him, in his own work. In King Kong, there is a sequence in which the female lead, Anne, is captured by the native people of Skull Island and offered up to Kong as a sacrifice. Scenes with similar setups can be observed in Clash of the Titans and Sinbad and the Golden Voyage, in which the people of Joppa offer Princess Andromeda to the Kraken, and Margiana is presented as a sacrifice to the one-eyed centaur, respectively. These films call to mind the recognizable imagery of the iconic appearance of Kong in his original film, creating parallels between these creatures and Kong, as each monster towers over a woman being offered to them as a sacrifice. This paints these monsters as imposing threats, but it also frames them as creatures who are revered within the narrative, encouraging the audience to also be taken aback by these creatures as they make their grand entrances. With these associations with Kong being made, each film builds on this connection with King Kong by having these creatures share Kong's fate. At the end of King Kong, the ape meets a tragic end as the planes shoot him down from the Empire State Building. It's a memorably tragic conclusion to Kong's tale as humans bring him out of his natural environment and place him in a man-made city in which he is so incompatible that it results in the death of this unique creature. In Clash of the Titans, Perseus arrives on the scene of Andromeda's sacrifice and presents the Kraken and hit with the head of the Medusa, turning it to stone, whereupon the Kraken collapses under its own weight. The Kraken may not be visibly conflicted over inflicting harm on human characters, but much like how Kong was brought to New York in chains, the film twice shows that the Kraken was kept in a cage by the gods of Olympus, let loose only when it suited their purposes. The Kraken, a titan who once ruled over the earth before the gods took over, is reduced to a prisoner, just as Kong was a king on Skull Island, but is brought to New York to entertain crowds. The Kraken is framed as being much less than he once was, or before he is destroyed by the film's live-action human characters. After the centaur carries Margiana off in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, he appears in the film's climax, assisting the film's villain before being brought down by Sinbad as he repeatedly sentences back. Despite being explicitly labeled in The Golden Voyage of Sinbad as a guardian of evil, the centaur does not harm Margiana, just as Kong does not harm Anne. Additionally, the animation of the centaur's death throes continues for some time, lingering on the creature's pain as it gasps for air and unsuccessfully struggles to remove Sinbad's dagger from the back of his shoulder before finally dying. Through Harryhausen establishing parallels between these creatures and Kong's status as a revered and imposing beast, these similarly violent ends at the hands of the human characters has the potential to be read as the loss of something unique, and perhaps even a creature that has been mistreated and misused by the sentient humans and human-like gods around them. Now that I've established a connection between some of Harryhausen's creatures and King Kong's story, I'm going to provide an example of how stop motion contributes to the sense of loss in these scenes by accentuating the moment these creatures cease to move. The movement of stop motion is often compared with the uncanny, a psychological phenomenon associated with that momentary unease we experience when we're uncertain whether to register something as either familiar or unfamiliar, alive or dead. Within stop motion, the viewer is somewhat conscious of the model's lifeless quality as an inanimate object in the real world, but also acknowledges the lifelike qualities of its animated performance. However, in these moments where Harryhausen's creatures cease to move, that tension between the lifelike and unlifelike disappears, which marks a clear distinction from when the creature appeared to be active, albeit in an uncanny fashion, and its deathly inertness. The death scenes of each of Harryhausen's creatures have that much more impact because the uncanny qualities of their stop motion makes us aware of what life is being instilled in these physical models while they are alive in the context of the narrative. The final shot of 1953's The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms focuses not on the human characters, but on the death of the Redosaurus, indicating how invested the audience is expected to be in this creature's ultimate fate. As the silhouette of its body is cast against the flames, the film calls to mind the destruction caused by this creature, and yet its motionless body contrasts against the flickering flames, emphasizing its lifelessness even further. The lingering shot of its inert body invites the possibility that its death is indeed lamentable. Harryhausen's Dynamation creatures are embedded in the history of US special effects cinema, and yet in the discussion of the relationship between narrative and US stop motion, they occupy a curious space. It could be argued that they merely serve as a vehicle for the action sequences for these films and that they aren't meaningfully characterized, but I hope that I've successfully presented the possibility today that as the main source of attraction and the most enduring element of these films, the Harryhausen creatures engender a sense of fantastical wonder to them, which, when paired with allusions to the imposing and tragic qualities of King Kong's character and story, as well as the impact of seeing a stop motion model suddenly become inert and entirely lifeless, has the capacity to instill feelings of regret at the lamentable loss of these unique creatures in the world of these narratives. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. It was a fascinating presentation, and very concise. I'd sent you a little message to say you've done 10 minutes. I thought, bang on, 15. Thank you very much, Toby. That's fantastic. I think knowing Farzaneh's interests and who's Farzaneh's the third in the presentations, I can already see connections that we might explore a little bit once we've heard the three presentations. But holding my thoughts back for the moment, we're going to move now to Laura-Beth Cowley. Laura-Beth, over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Yeah. Yeah, as Simon mentioned earlier, my name is Laura-Beth Cowley. I'm a practice-based PhD researcher based at the Centre for Fine Print Research at the University of West England here in Bristol. In my research, I'm looking at the use of 3D printing as a digital tool in the stop motion industry, and as part of the investigation, I'm conducting practice-led research using 3D printing to investigate various theoretical elements of my research. Today, I will be speaking to you about one of my most recent case studies that was conducted in collaboration with auteur filmmaker Ainsley Henderson. So for those of you who may not be aware of Ainsley's work, here is a short clip from his 2018 short film Stems. Ainsley Henderson is a BAFTA-winning animator, director, and writer. His work often uses lo-fi craft aesthetic puppet making processes, utilizing found objects and organic materials. His films are often reflective, self-aware, and use animation as both a medium and a narrative device. Often working by himself or with creative partner Will Anderson, Ainsley could be referred to as a hyper-auteur, as much of the time he makes all elements of the visual work himself. From writing to puppet fabrication, from lighting to shooting, and of course, animating and directing. Inspired by the reflective nature of Ainsley's films, I decided to contact him back in late 2019 to discuss the potential of working collaboratively on a project that would look at the use of 3D printing as a unique visual material in and of itself. Aiming to create a piece that would reflect on the faults and abnormalities of the printing process in a poignant and narrative way, and reflect on the way 3D printing materials have their own aesthetic within the medium of stop motion. However, whilst discussing this project, an opportunity arose to work with Ainsley on his upcoming BAFTA-funded film, Shackle. Shackle is a short animated film that follows 3 archetypical spirits exploring conflicted human drives of creativity, possessiveness, and our desire for status. The film follows 3 characters referred to in the script as she, him, and it. As the story unfolds, the characters become more and more envious and covetous of the object of their desire. The film is going to be shot in the real world, in a real life woodland surrounding, and is shot over the course of a year in all seasons. As a film with no dialogue, the eyes of the individual puppets play a pivotal narrative role in portraying to the audience thoughts, ideas, and emotions as they arise in the characters. So this became the focus of the study. The aim and the objectives were drawn thusly: to create eye mechanisms for 3 scales that allow for subtle movement and post-process customization, as well as in shot replacement of the internal eyeball. Create hollow, full eyeballs that allow for internal painting to create depth, and be adaptable and reusable for future projects. Use collaborative and iterative action research to develop an eye mechanism that achieves the stated aims by creating a scaled CAD design process to create files, and work with SLA resin printers to create lightweight, high detail parts for use in auteur production. As part of my overall study, this case study was to sit within a section of my thesis to do with authorship, to question how 3D printing could be used to give greater authorial control to filmmakers whose work is who work in a hyper-auteur way. So keeping Ainsley's authorial voice throughout the process was important to me and the study. I was to act as an advisor, a facilitator of the process, and aid where possible, but it was of paramount importance to keep Ainsley as involved as possible at every stage of the design process. So Ainsley had created some initial test designs, having recently taught himself Blender. The first test proved to be too unstable due to the lack of an enclosure for the eyeball and a lack of stability in the stem at the back. It was subsequently decided that the eyelid should also be part of the design, at which stage Ainsley provided a second test, this time with an external cup to house both eyelids and eyeballs. These brackets would allow the eyelids to pivot around the eyeball, and this raised bed would keep the eyeballs elevated within the socket. However, once printed, there were 2 main issues. Firstly, the printing type, which was a printing type called FDM, which stands for Fused Deposit Modeling, and is from the form of 3D printing you are all probably most acquainted with, which is when a cord string of plastic is pushed out of a nozzle in layers over time to create a 3D object. By using this material, it created textural ridges, which would require a lot of post-processing, which would not only take time, but would reduce the accuracy of the print overall. Secondly, the design of the joint proved difficult to construct after printing, as you had to bend the lids aggressively to fit over the brackets, leading to breakages. At this stage of the case study, it was decided that I would take over the CAD modeling of the project, and on my suggestion, we would look at using a finer, more detailed 3D printing technology known as SLA, which stands for stereolithography. This involves using light to cure very thin layers of resin, layer by layer, creating an overall finer finish with much higher tolerance accuracy. So a further design was sketched by Ainsley, as you can see here, at which point I created an initial design. A further requirement arose for a set of slitted eyelids to work with the socketed system. So 2 alternative designs were created. We chose to use Formlabs SLA printers as leaders in accuracy and their range of materials available. An initial material tests were created to assess and address any tolerance controls that may have come into play when transferring the digital design into the physical. Although SLA offers a good like-for-like result once printed, there is always the possibility for organic flaws to occur during the printing and curing process. So after receiving and reviewing the test objects, a series of iterative changes were made to fulfill all requirements set out in the initial aim, as well as some additional designs featured that were raised during the initial testing stages. So here's a video that just sort of shows you through the CAD designs, but I'm going to talk over this to explain why things were made. So as discussed earlier, 3 scales were needed for the 3 puppets at the center of the film, the smaller of which is also required to have overlapping slitted eyelids like that of a camera iris, as well as normal sliding eyelids like that of a human. There was a desire to keep the more mechanical parts, such as the internal cup, as thin as possible, but there was also particular practical functional layer thickness requirements that had to be adhered to. Essentially, the smaller the thickness, the more fragile the piece would become. At the end of the day, we are talking about resin at a thickness of between 0.5 to 1.5 mil thick. The medium and larger scale only required human-like eyelids that met in the middle, but the changes in overall scale altered the clearance and tolerance between parts, which meant that each scale had to be tweaked in areas that were meant to sit together or glide over one another. This was of particular importance when considering the clips that were housed into recesses on either side of the internal or external cup. A stalk was added to the back, both to keep the internal cup aloft and at the right position within the overall design, as well as stopping the eyelids from rotating to the back, making it harder for the animator to move them into position. The tolerances of the eyeballs within their cup itself was also of importance, as it needed to sit snugly, but also allowed distance for post-processing and adding of a lacquer to create a shiny, wet look surface to the eyeballs. There was also some consideration for the need for some kind of lubrication, which ended up not being necessary in the end. Material-wise, a mix of grey and white standard resin were used, much of which was done in white, as the only thing that needed to meet a specific colour profile was the eyeballs themselves. Everything else was going to be enclosed. By keeping much of the print to one material and one colour, it meant we were able to fill up entire beds of printers to make it more cost-effective. However, we did use an elastic resin for the internal cup of the smallest set of eyes to reduce the clearance as much as possible. Since the study, we have looked at potential of using tougher, more durable and rigid resins created for more impact mechanical parts, also offered by Formlabs, to address the issue of breakages of the extremely small, thin pieces, such as the eyelids. After the prints were created, began the task of post-processing and construction, such as sanding and removing any supports from the printing process. After which, Ainsley began to apply his signature authorial aesthetic to the pieces. Experimentation led him to incorporate natural fibers and materials to the manufactured pieces by using colored wool fiber to construct the iris, painting the inside of the pupil black, and using resin to dome over the eyeball, then applying a couple of thin layers of lacquer, he was able to create these beautiful mesmeric eyes with depth and craft built into them. The eye systems were housed in 3 entirely different puppets. They were to work together and be part of the same world, but offer different expressions and performances largely through their eyes and gestural movements. So in conclusion, the study provided the filmmaker with a bespoke system for both this current project and future projects. The eye mechanisms are customizable whilst remaining structurally and mechanically functional. This combining of traditional and digital craft has in effect allowed for a greater level of detail and complexity to be afforded to the filmmaker, whilst also providing a future way of working that may give his films a greater authorial fingerprint. By involving the filmmaker in every aspect of the process, the study has provided new knowledge and new ways of working to the filmmaker whilst keeping his authority over the output. A full conclusion will only be possible when the film is completed, and we can see how impactful and important a role the eyes play in the film, and how this comes across to the audience. But for now, I believe the filmmaker is satisfied with what was achieved. I've been granted special permission from Ainsley to show you the completed puppets at the stage, but only for a short while. So here we are. Aren't they lovely? And that's it. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura-Beth. That's great. More connections to my mind being possible to make between the presentations so far. But we have one more before we get to questions and open things up a bit more, and that's Farzaneh Yazdandoost.
Let me share my screen. Okay, hello everyone, my name is Farzaneh, and today in my presentation I'm going to discuss the way physical materials are exhibited in Wes Anderson animation as independent entities rather than the means only to serve the narrative. This is a part of my PhD thesis on the specificity of stop-motion animation and the photographic reality in Wes Anderson and Susie Templeton's puppet animations. Wes Anderson is mainly a live-action filmmaker with his own unique style of filmmaking. With regards to animation, he insists on employing stop-motion puppet animation in its traditional fashion. By emphasizing traditional fashion, I mean that it gives him the opportunity to play with the physical materials as well as the specificity of stop-motion animation. He has directed 2 puppet animations, Fantastic Mr. Fox and Isle of Dogs, and my focus today is on Fantastic Mr. Fox. In order to clarify what I mean by exhibitionist approach, it would be helpful to take a look at the idea of Tom Gunning's about the cinema of attractions. In order to discuss the cinema of attractions, Tom Gunning put it in contrast to the narrative cinema and offers that films before 1906 aimed to display something, whether it be the image or the device of that image, the device which the image was made by, or the process of making the image. They just wanted to encourage the audience to see something. So as the primary goal was visibility, the narrative was of the second importance, if at all. In this respect, Gunning considers Lumiere's actuality films and Méliès early trick films as the instance of the cinema of attractions, because Lumiere tried to exhibit what was happened in front of his camera, while Méliès tried to show the capability of camera in creating the extraordinary images. So Gunning suggests that Cinema of attractions addresses the audience directly, arouses curiosity, and supplies pleasure. As a kind of strategy, the cinema of attractions try to acknowledge the audience. For example, the actors look directly at the camera or bow to it, but it can spoil the realistic illusion of cinema, so the narrative cinema tends to conceal all the traces of its production. Gunning also suggests that narrative films dominated the cinema of attractions after 1906, but the cinema of attractions survived in avant-garde films. Therefore, the cinema of attractions is self-reflexive, while the narrative cinema is self-sufficient. The cinema of attractions addresses the audience, while the narrative cinema absorbs the audience. The cinematic devices in the cinema of attractions are the characters themselves, while the cinematic devices in narrative cinema are in the service of the characters in order to create a world of narrative. Considering that, I'm going to argue that the physical materials in Fantastic Mr. Fox are characters and their attractions dominate the narrative. Wes Anderson tends to employ stop motion animation in its traditional fashion because in stop motion, physical materials are in their most visible conditions. Also, as the puppets and the sets are miniatures and the distance between them and the camera is very short, the camera is a magnifier. Also, because all the process happened in three-dimensional environment, the laws of physics can affect the final illusion of movement. Wes Anderson tends to employ the materials, the physical materials, as they are in their very natural condition. That's why there are so many close textures in the images. So an excess of haptic information is given to the audience, and the audience are always aware of the presence of physical materials. And all the physical materials in Fantastic Mr. Fox can remind the audience of their presence and the audience's prior experience with them in their everyday life. Fantastic Mr. Fox is made in CGI era, in which digital VFX was and is extensively employed in live action movies and animation as well. But Wes Anderson uses physical materials in order to create the flowing visual materials such as water, smoke, and fire. This approach, for instance, gives the opportunity to the cotton to preserve its look and condition while it is stimulating the smoke, as you can see in this still in the bottom. Also using physical materials as visual effects display the mastery of animators, refer the audience to the process of animation and show them the trick. In this respect, it evokes the question of how in audience's mind they will constantly ask how these concrete materials were kept suspended and manipulated frame by frame. Here are some examples of using physical materials as visual effects in Fantastic Mr. Fox, and the video doesn't have sound. Another consequence of the short distance between sets, puppets, and the camera is the shallow depth of field of the image. It means that the materials that are closer to the camera are very sharp and focused, while the rest of the image is fluid. It somehow can accentuate the physicality of the materials in the focused areas and make the details extremely visible. Close-ups and extreme close-ups can be found numerously in fantastic Mr. Fox. The close-ups can put the materials in their most visible conditions in the way that all the details are extremely visible. For instance, in these images, you can see all the stitches of the knitted bandit hats and the jacket. So these close-ups are a kind of intriguing and invite the audience to see what they are showing in these pictures, as if the materials look directly at the camera. In these two instances, the close-ups don't have any narrative functions. They are here just for the sake of displaying. And here we can see that we can see the difference between close-ups in the service of narrative and the close-ups for the purpose of exhibition. Accidents are inherent in stop motion animation. The prominent example of accident is arbitrary movement. By arbitrary movement, I mean the specific kind of motion that is rendered as a result of constant touch of the animator on the puppets. In particular, when the puppets are covered by fur or textile, because these are the kind of materials that are really likely to be modified unintentionally during the process. So such kind of movements will be produced. Arbitrary movement can highlight the physicality of materials and their condition. Also, they can refer the audience to the presence of an animator, because the arbitrary movement can be considered as the fingerprints of the animators. And as such, they create attraction in stop motion puppet animation. I have written a whole chapter in my thesis about arbitrary movement, and there I suggested that arbitrary movement can be employed as a kind of narrative supporter, in the way that by decreasing or increasing in the amount of arbitrary movement, for instance, the inner emotion of puppets characters can be shown. And for instance, when the puppet is stationary for a period of time, arbitrary movement can be helpful to make them look lively. But in Fantastic Mr. Fox, the arbitrary movement in the puppets are all the result of the numbers of the time that the puppets are touched by the animator. And they, as such, are the specific effect of stop motion puppet animation, and as such, they are attractions. Here are some examples of arbitrary movement in Fantastic Mr. Fox, and you can clearly see the traces of the hand of animators on the puppets. In conclusion, the physical materials are the main characters in Fantastic Mr. Fox, the textures, of course. The textures speak for themselves in this animation. They are not the mere tools for storytelling. And finally, materials and the ways they are treated, I mean the devices and the way that they are employing, are the attractions of Fantastic Mr. Fox. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Farzaneh. Very good, thanks. Great, well, everyone has kept to time extraordinarily well and provided us with numerous things to think about, and I think there's lots of connections between the presentations. Now, I'm sure that the presenters have questions for one another, and I know certainly that they'd like to take questions from the audience, as it were. So if you would like to ask any of the three presenters a question, we're very happy for you to raise a hand and speak out loud. That would be fantastic. We're very happy also if you'd like to simply type them into the chat, and I can read them out, or indeed Laura-Beth, Farzaneh, or Toby can read them out. So do feel free to present your questions to the group in whichever fashion you'd like. Perhaps I can have the first go, though. A phrase that sticks in my mind, Laura-Beth, from your presentation was to do with the faults and abnormalities of 3D printing. And it seemed to me that when you were describing to us the process by which these objects are being 3D printed, it seems to be a very precise industrial process. Nevertheless, it seemed to me to be key for you that there was some kind of faults or abnormalities still possible in the transition from the model once it's printed. And I'd quite like to hear a little bit more about that. What are the abnormalities of and faults of 3D printing, and perhaps we could trace that through the other two presentations too. Toby, I wondered, did Ray Harryhausen think of his art as embracing aspects of what Farzaneh calls arbitrary motion, which comes with using those kinds of fur-like textures in his puppets? Is there a thread to do with faults and abnormalities, whether it's traditional stop-motion puppet animation or 3D printing?
Yeah, so technically or traditionally, no. The whole point of using 3D printing is to sort of erase those flaws. But I'm interested in the kind of the complex kind of conversation between that, like, as Farzaneh mentioned, as obviously discussed in her talk, that's one of the main features of stop motion. So why are we erasing it? Which is a big part of my argument for the way in which it's being used. So although this case study, as you rightly said, doesn't really feature those flaws because the project went on a different direction, that section was about why I'd initially got in contact with Ainsley. But then because this other project came in and he needed something 3D printed, that sort of took over. So another case that I'm doing currently is sort of looking more at that aspect of it, about the flaws, and it's going back to that FDM style printer, which this is an FDM printer. So it sort of uses a coil piece of plastic that melts through, and there's a lot of flaws that you don't want that come up all the time with them. But I was interested as a stop motion animator and filmmaker by trade, how you could utilize those kind of natural flaws. So with FDM printing, the main one being that you get those quite distinct layer lines. Mm. So I'm making a film at the moment that's using those layer lines as a visual device. And me and Ainsley were talking about doing a project about that possibly after my PhD is done, because he has this film to finish. But that also utilizes that kind of idea, because I think that's what's kind of not missing, but is an area that's sort of under investigated within the combination of stop motion and 3D printing. There have been people that have used it, but generally it's either used to be like, oh, look, this is 3D printed. Isn't that cool? And there's one film that was made by the National Film Board of Canada that used 3D printing to create like wrinkles on the face of a character that sort of utilized the natural flaws of 3D printing, or the natural facets of 3D printing in a kind of visual narrative way.
Well, to combine your question, Simon, with a question I've seen Eugene has brought up about how far might arbitrary movement disrupt audience empathy for characters, and particularly in moments of pathos. I think that for Ray Harryhausen, I certainly know that he of stop motion, often referring to it as a nightmarish, it has a nightmarish quality to it. I think that for the materiality and the arbitrary motions of it, it's I think manifested as something that would be an extension of that. It's a sort of tangent from empathy, but selling the vitality of the creatures that he would animate. And I think that there would be one of the first pieces of feedback he got given from his mentor, Willis O'Brien, when he was very young. He sent off some animation he had done himself, and he got some criticism that the musculature and the anatomy of his dinosaurs that he had animated looked like sausages, that they didn't actually feel like it was selling that. And I think that from that point onward, he studied that quite a bit to make sure that he could sell that interiority, that feeling that these were animals you were looking at, creatures that, even if they were fantastical, like not just dinosaurs or fictional takes on now extinct creatures, but entirely fantastical or sci-fi creatures, he wanted to convey that feeling of like selling you on the creature being alive. And I think that moments of those arbitrary movements, far from, to me, sort of disrupting audience empathy or connection with the animated subject, actually enhance and because there's a different way of engaging with stop motion, where, as Farzaneh, you say, the materiality becomes the attraction. And to me, that means that the characters become the materials that they are represented by. And that means that in Ray Harryhausen, there was a saber-tooth tiger in the third Sinbad film he did, which would feature that same level of arbitrary movement in the fur as between frames. And I think that actually gives the materials that vibrancy, that vitality. And in the context of Fantastic Mr. Fox, I think that it's in moments of pathos, it means that you can actually see there's a feeling of interiority, internal thinking, that even if the characters don't express anything, there is a movement, a subtle movement there. And in the case of Harryhausen, I think that just sells the idea that these are living natural creatures, which just makes that their destruction and their deaths all the more, like, it sells that.
I think initially arbitrary movement is a kind of effect specific to stop motion animation. And we as audiences, when we are encountering a film, we know that this is stop motion and there are some expectations from us. And this, I think, helps that those flaws, imperfections, or anything we call that arbitrary movement, avoid, being disruptive in this respect. And then it depends on how much do you use them. For instance, in Fantastic Mr. Fox, Wes Anderson approached arbitrary movement as something to experiment. In Isle of Dog, if you see that, there is a kind of consistency, there is a coherent use of arbitrary movement, and it's not that much disruptive as it is in Fantastic Mr. Fox. So there are so many factors in this respect. You cannot, choose. You cannot talk about arbitrary movement without considering these, factors.
Could I just ask Farzaneh and Toby specifically about the connection between these two filmmakers that you're looking at, Wes Anderson and Harryhausen, and their use, in a way, to my sense, that it's a similar kind of a technique that they're using, presumably. Are they? Is there? I mean, Farzaneh, you talked about Wes Anderson making stop motion puppet animations in a traditional fashion, there being a tradition to his way of working. Do you see links between the two filmmakers? Is it obvious?
Exactly. It's really obvious that Wes Anderson is under the influence of Ray Harryhausen. He admits that in many of his interviews that he wants to use stop motion animation as Ray Harryhausen did. And I think there is a connection between them.
And is there something to do? I mean, I know, Farzaneh, from supervising your dissertation, that you're interested in the exploring the kind of a realism associated with this arbitrary motion, that it points somehow or other towards the materiality of the medium. Do we also get something of that in Harryhausen's films, because of the conjunction of live action and the puppet animation?
There's certainly something going on with Harryhausen's animation where I think that it's difficult for anyone working in stop motion to not take some influences in style or approach to him. But I think that actually with Harryhausen, there's this curious sort of paradox or balancing act going on where, as much as he is selling you on these creatures, there is this acknowledgement of a divide between the live action and the stop motion that, in my mind, it feels as if in both a practical and thematic degree, the stop motion creatures and sequences embody the fantasy of, or the fantastical elements of the films they're featured in, whereas the live action elements, the characters, are the elements that feel a bit more connected to the real world that the audience is familiar with. And so this interplay between them feels as if it's a clash between them, where you could do a reading where because so many of these creatures end up dying by the end because they represent threats to the protagonists, that there is some sort of statement of the incompatibility between these two elements, the live action and the real, and the stop motion and the fantasy. But at the same time, and this is why I can't say it so categorically, and yet I will have to find a way to do so in the conclusion to my chapter on this, is that there is a play between stop motion and live action. One sequence that comes to mind is in Clash of the Titans, when Perseus is trying to tame the Pegasus. It's at one point he has lassoed the horse with a rope. Now, the horse is still being animated in stop motion, but there is a literal thread connecting the stop motion represented Pegasus and the actor playing Perseus holding a rope. And it's because of a clever way of splicing footage of, in reality, the actor had a rope around a big rig, essentially, and was interacting with that, whereas in the stop motion, the splicing, it was just put over with the rope connected. And so there is this playfulness, and Harryhausen has even said this, is that even for the time, it wasn't necessarily a case of trying to fool audiences into believing this was real. He was very aware that even back for contemporary audiences, it would be obvious that this was an effect they were seeing, which is why I think that, Farzaneh, your idea that stop motion becomes the attraction is the connection. That I think that with many stop motion films, particularly because of its rareness, there is a rare quality to it as this mainstream form of animation, that a lot of the audiences come to it to see it as that. So I've gone on a long tangent, so I'm going to stop talking now, but yes, many ideas that connect.
I just wanted to mention that, I just want to add something, that we have to consider that Ray Harryhausen was using stop motion as a visual effect. He wants to create the illusion of reality, you know, that was the thing he was trying to do. While Wes Anderson is using stop motion as animation, as, you know, not in the mixture with a live action movie. This is the very, you know, critical difference between these two filmmakers, that the approach toward stop motion is totally different.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a little aside, if I may, I think it's maybe important to also remember the period of time difference there is between the two, and the amount of equipment and skill level that Ray was pretty much doing this self-taught by himself, blind. And the Fantastic Mr. Fox people, it was an actual choice. They could choose to have made the puppets differently. They could have choose to articulate the puppets differently and perform it, and they could actually see what was happening on screen as they were doing it, which Ray certainly didn't.
That score, Laura-Beth, I have a question which I think connects to this, and it was beyond the purview of your presentation, but you mentioned it, to do with the business of evaluating the qualities of these 3D printed objects. Finally, when they're part and parcel of the film, you know, as a viewer, you could evaluate the particular qualities and faults and abnormalities, etc., of the printed objects. But what I wondered is there a stage in the process of shooting those things, the puppets, the 3D printed aspects, the process of doing the frame by frame shooting, the stop motion, as it were, in the camera, in the filming, that somehow or other contributes to the material qualities of those 3D printed objects?
Well, yeah, because especially as it's not, this isn't a system of replacements, which is often the case with 3D printing, that the library is there and you have to utilize it in whatever way you can as an animator. But this isn't that. It's a mechanic, so it's in no way different to an armature. So in that way, the performance will come from Ainsley. The mechanic is just there to give him the best possible range available, and it's just that little bit above having an eyeball stuck in some plasticine, or burrowed into a wooden head and then built around. The idea being, it mostly comes down to those eyelids and sort of being able to have that real slow, subtle movement, because he really wanted to have that kind of almost hyper realistic movement in these quite unusual puppets that are also going to have to be shot in a real world environment at ridiculous temperatures, which also means that he does have to have a certain amount of like speed to his movements, because if he doesn't get the thing captured in time, the whole light of the day is going to have shifted, and you might have like, he can't finesse or finagle in the same way that he would do in a studio, which sort of adds another kind of level of complexity, which was part of the reason why having something a little bit more succinct and something that didn't involve like doing like claymation and having to do individual sculpts of the eye was important. So it sort of frees up him as a performer, really.
Okay, great. Now, you may have questions for one another, which would be fantastic, fascinating to hear, but I mustn't I feel like if I don't read out the questions in the chat here, which have cropped up there now, people will think I'm ignoring them. And I wouldn't want Lizzie Hobbs to think I was ignoring her. We've had one question from Eugene, which Toby took on very well. Lizzie's question is arbitrary movement in stop motion perhaps similar to drawn animators using a boiling line to give life and evidence of a human hand?
I would argue that nope, it isn't. Purely because the arbitrary movement, as I understand it from what Farzaneh has been explaining, is it's arbitrary, so it's not constructed. Where a boil is constructed, like you can choose not to draw multiple frames of a still image to make it have that boil. But it is there to sort of mimic life, but there's a lot more than arbitrary movement that is needed to give a puppet some sensation of movement. There's especially with voices, it's those tiny little micro movements in the eyes. So the eyeballs, even if it's like everything still, there'll be this tiny little vibration in the eye that sort of stop, or like glistening or something. Farzaneh will know far more about this than me, but Wes is very well known for like being like, okay, and now they don't move for 20 minutes, which in stop motion terms is days and days and days, and it's very painful to not give it all the kind of slapstick performance.
I would argue that in terms of the effect that it can achieve, there is some overlap in that the boiling lines just adds extra movement to it. But as you say, particularly with animation that has been achieved through digital means, I think that there is certainly a lot more effort going into deliberately including boiling lines than there is, like, in terms of it's very specific. And a great example I can think of is a recent game called Later Alligator, which has this very charming style to it, and all of the characters have this kind of accentuated messiness and eccentricity to them because of the boiling lines. But when you take a look at it, it is very much something that is obviously deliberately included. I think with the closest example I can think of is when with Aardman, the famous anecdote that they will sometimes deliberately include thumbprints, not just like leave them in, but actually put them in, to the point of even in some of their CG work, like Arthur Christmas, putting it in certain frames. That is a similar level of, I think, manufactured arbitrariness that I think overlaps. But it's a sort of like messy thing where I think that there is overlap in terms of the effects, but at the end of the day, because they're the results of different means of production in different media, so there is always going to be some specificity that delineates the two.
I'd also argue that potentially the boil in stop motion comes from the camera and the atmos on set rather than the puppets or the animation, because that's the kind of shimmeriness from being in volume. And also being the fact that in stop motion, like what would be referred to as the boil, or what this arbitrary movement is referred to as noise. And noise, like if you think of it in terms of sound, where it obviously comes from, is a unwanted element, technically.
There's two quite nice points made by Kathy. I think one is a recommendation for reading on Anderson and stop motion, physical effects and stop motion in his stop motion films. And a suggestion of the boiling line is there sometimes in animations to hide the inertia of the illusion of animation, whilst arbitrary motion is much more purposeful in Anderson's work. It's interesting, you know, it's purposeful perhaps, Farzaneh, but in a way, there's something chance about it, isn't it? There's something out of the control of the animator, which I think is probably the unique aspect of it. Mariam. maybe if we think of animating with paint as it dries, then it could be similar to the arbitrary motion.
Firstly, I like the idea of animating with pain.
Paint.
All animation is animation with pain.
It goes without saying, doesn't it?
But I'd also say that a painted animation, although is a 2D technique, it is also stop motion because it's happening under camera.
It is
So
made
like
of materials.
Yeah, it's that kind of hybrid space, like cutout animation.
As far as it's unintentional and out of control, it can be arbitrary.
I think that whenever you're dealing with comparisons between things that certain approaches to filmmaking or animation can achieve, there's always going to be some connections, but there will always be a certain amount of getting lost in the details of trying to make it fit in the same way that like applying a genre can sometimes lead you twisting and knots. So I think that a lot of the time it does culminate into this place where you are saying that they're being created in different spaces, I think.
I think we may wrap up in a minute. What do you think, guys? Unless it would be nice if you had, I didn't want to cut you off in case you had questions for each other after your presentations, or maybe you'd like to continue those discussions outside, but is there anything you wanted to raise about each other's presentations, thoughts you had, connections you made?
I just was really curious about flow in 3D printing, Laura-Beth. I just want you, if you can, explain it a little bit. What kind of flow can occur in 3D printing? You mentioned something about flows.
Floors. Yeah, okay. So there's a quite nice website that's called like 3D printed glitches. And it's basically when the 3D printer just decides it doesn't want to work for a while. And so it's all to do with, especially when it comes to FDM printing, which is the coiling system I told you about. A lot of that comes down to the layer height, so the individual height that the nozzle is going between the layers, and the adhesion to the base. But sometimes there's this really fun thing that can happen where it just goes, okay, I'm not going to adhere anymore to that layer, and it just keeps coiling and coiling and coiling. You don't see it happening. So you have this beautifully rendered piece, so like half a body, and then all of a sudden it will just spaghetti noodle stuff forever. And I find that area kind of interesting, like if there's because it's that difficult thing with stop motion of like this idea of arbitrary things, or things that don't, or flaws or glitches or problems or noise, but also needing it to be actually precise and actually work. So it's interesting in this idea of being able to manufacture those flaws in a stable way so you could still have like replacements, but by its inherent nature you can't always manufacture those flaws because they won't be flaws anymore. They'd be manufactured faults, I guess.
Then this is the matter of machine. This is the flows in machine. And for instance, for in higher technologies, it can be removed. It can be solved.
Yeah. So the flaws that come are from, okay, so there's two things. So there's the flaws that come from it just not being set up properly like that. And then there's the flaws that aren't really flaws, they're just facets of the printing process. So with this particularly, it's the fact that you do have those layer lines. The other thing being that often with both this and SLA printing, you need like structures to hold the thing in place so that it doesn't like weep as it goes. So which are called supports. And so there have been examples of people using 3D printing and keeping the supports to represent other visual mediums. So Job, Joris and Meriki, who are, I think, Dutch animators, they did a nice short music video series of GIFs that had characters using this SLA printing with these really interesting tree-like support systems, and the support was representing gravity because it was for an album called Gravity. So it's sort of showing the physical action of gravity. So it's being able to do that thing that's quite common when you're sort of doing stop motion and things that are addressing the materiality of the process, is using those things that are like negatives or flaws as a narrative device.
Yeah, you know, because I have the machines that, for example, Leica studios use. And I was thinking what kind of flaws they can, you know, face.
So one of their major like flaws, but was a flaw, but ended up being an asset, was that the type of printing they use is kind of powder printing, and that doesn't, the technology requires you to have no support, so you don't need anything to hold it. It sort of, it creates layers in this big bed of powder, and the powder acts as a support as it's being cured. So you don't end up with any of those kind of traditional flaws. The difference being the natural attribution of that printing is that it has this kind of powdery, dusty texture to it that you can blast off, but they chose not to on, for example, Paranorman, because it actually helped with the lighting to soften the focus so that you didn't get that horrible plasticky shininess that you would do from things made of plastic or resin. So in that sense, it's using, like I said, the natural attributes of the 3D printer, not only for its mechanical purposes and what it was really manufactured for, which was engineering, but also as a visual device, which, you know, and Leica particularly were very instrumental in incorporating color into prints. And so they did a lot of work with those printers to get that. So now there's this incredible breadth of visual color and systems that you can put into 3D printing that wouldn't really have existed without, as far as I'm aware, without Leica. And it may only be of use to Leica, but it's still there if people want.
Exactly.
That
and they have a very powerful team for their softwares.
Yeah, so they, you know, they're able, because they had that partnership with that company from day one, they've also been able to develop the technology with the people. So they have engineers and coders and programmers, as well as like very intelligent and trained animators, CG modelers. Yeah, it's and that's why they have the same team that they've had for like the last 10 years, and why they're constantly able to innovate and do more and more spectacular visual things.
I love the ideas of this and what your presentation was about, Laura-Beth, about how technology, I think that a lot of, at first there's a romanticization of everything for this one piece of art was built from the ground up, but the reality, and I think this is actually a much more exciting scenario, is that technologies they roll forward and they get innovated upon. And so when technology is created in the process of one production, it will actually have a fundamental effect on the next ones and can make the process of putting it together so much more like efficient. And I think that that's it's one of those things that the technical and I think in the industry of animation and just technology has fantastic possibilities in that regard.
I think it's one of those interesting things about like incorporating digital tools and technology into things, is that the assumption is that it's been done to make it easier or quicker, but actually all it's done is made it far more complex than it ever was. And rather than like learning from what they're going to go, okay, so this is how we could simplify, they're like, no, let's now print every single frame, and then let's add complexity and texture and pattern into all of those things, and how can we get greater and greater depth. So rather than, which I feel like is a very A artist but B animator trait of like, I could take the easy road, but let's see how I can make this far more complicated than it needs to be, and stop motion is a particularly good one for that.
The recipe is let's get proof of concept, and then that means that when we get to the next one, we can innovate upon that and sort of refine and expand upon it.
Exactly.
Fantastic. It's wonderful to hear you speaking about each other's ideas and presentations, and then coming together with more ideas. I think we will wrap it up here. So I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's joined us for these presentations. It's great to have people here and indeed chipping in with questions. It would be nice. I was just thinking, Laura-Beth, Farzaneh, Toby, you did probably flash up your email addresses, I think, in the context of your presentations. But if you would like to put your email addresses in the chat here, then people have them on screen for a little bit longer, should they want to contact you and if they've got questions that they haven't asked or want to follow anything up with you. And whilst you're doing that, I just wanted to say thank you very much to you three for your great presentations, which are very stimulating. And thank you very much also to Farzaneh, especially, who's, I keep saying it's her gig. She organised this and said, Simon, can we have a PhD animation research seminar and invite, do it on Zoom and have it in this format. And I'm very glad she's done it. And it's the first one, PhD animation research, stop motion aesthetics. Not a very jazzy title, but perhaps there could be a more jazzy title. But anyway, it suggests to me that there could be more in the series. So perhaps there's people in the audience here who'd like to contribute to such a thing. If there's another theme to do with PhD animation research in the series, maybe Farzaneh's the one to get in touch with if you'd like to contribute to such an event.
Yeah, please. I just wanted to say, if anyone can take my words to, whoever that is doing PhD or is about to start doing a PhD, please come and contribute to this, series of events, because after a while it can be a very reliable database for the people who are interested, because we are going to document all these events. And at the end, I just want to thank Simon for your support and encouragement for this event, and thank Toby and Laura-Beth for trusting me and being the first person to contribute to this event. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Farzaneh, and thank you, Simon, both of you. This has been a great occasion, and thank you, Laura-Beth, for your presentation. This has just been a delight.
Good luck with the PhDs, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for reaching out.
And to anyone present who's also going through their PhDs or whatever research, good luck to all of you guys as well.
Solidarity.
Okay. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.